All right. Well, what we'll do is, in the interest of time, we'll get started, and Kathy will let anybody else in who arrives as they turn up. So it's my very great pleasure to be welcoming Julie Gareleck, who is the author of a wonderful new book called Dare to Become: From the Corner Booth to the Corner Office. And I was lucky enough to receive an advanced copy of the book, which is coming out in September, and was able to read it, and then the opportunity to interview Julie, which is just fantastic. So thank you so much for being here, Julie, all the way from the United States on the East Coast, where it's currently 7 o'clock at night.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So I guess I'll just run through your bio just really quickly for the audience. So Julie is a respected and trusted leader in business communities that extend right down the east coast of the United States, including CEOs and entrepreneurs of small to mid-sized businesses, as well as the Fortune 1000. She's the CEO of Junction Creative, which is an award-winning strategic agency that combines the intellectual capital of a business consulting firm with the creative execution of an advertising agency. She's consulted with more than 450 companies to build sustainable revenue-generating strategies. So yes, welcome. Like I said, Julie, it's a real pleasure to have you here. And your book is such a great read. I had a chat to Julie, just a preliminary chat a couple of days ago, and I said to her that the book is kind of like talking to a friend. It's one of those really easy to read books where you kind of just get absorbed in it and you read the book and you kind of get through it and you're like, wow, as opposed to some business books that you get where you know, the concepts are great, but they're quite complex and you have to keep stopping and thinking, writing things down or going back and reading it again because it was a little bit hard to digest. So Julie's book is just wonderful. So Julie, I want to sort of start really at the beginning of your journey. So you started out, as you said, from in the corner booth to the corner office. So starting out waitressing in your family's restaurant way back when. So if you'd like to sort of take us through the, you know, where it's all started for you.
Absolutely. So when I was a teenager and I was in high school, my parents, who had worked for corporations their entire career, my dad worked for a corporation for more than 20 years. My mother had worked for a bank for about the same time. They approached my sister and I and said, "Hey, do you want the good news or the bad news?" And the bad news was that he quit his job. And the good news was that he invested in a local restaurant called the Avenue Restaurant. It was a 110-seat casual dining restaurant that did breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And, you know, unbeknownst to us, this would become a family endeavor. So it required that all four of us would be working the family business. So it really did start in the corner booth. My sister and I both worked there. We were originally filled in where other folks were missing or if they were out, and then eventually became a waitress there. And that's really where the book starts.
And it's wonderful, you know, and I remember reading towards the end of the book, you talked about how you went back there with your dad many, many years later, and the restaurant had changed hands a few times, and I think you said it was a noodle restaurant now, and just sort of sitting there looking at things that had changed, the things that hadn't changed, and they still had the original logo up in the restaurant at some point. That must have been a really nostalgic thing to do.
It was. And to do it with my dad was even more incredible. He actually hadn't been back to the restaurant in almost 10 years to eat. And I love the restaurant that's there now, May's Noodle House, and love their food, and went in. And as we sat down in one of the booths, that are still the same as they were when we owned the restaurant, we looked back in the corner and there was a door that had the old logo on it, and it's still there, and it's part of the fixture. And so I said to him, I'm like, what a great moment to come back, and the past is still here. Like the bones are still good. So it was a special time.
So you obviously moved away from working for your family. So tell us a story about how that came about.
Absolutely. Yeah. After I graduated from college, I moved to Europe for 6 months, worked in public relations for a PR agent there, and then realized it was too far away from my family. So I moved back to Gettysburg, and really at that time, the towers fell. So it sort of changed the trajectory of where I went. I was looking to go to New York City. And then after that experience, decided that Philadelphia was a great second, a great second city. So I transitioned to Philadelphia and started working for an entrepreneurship institute, working with really early stage companies who were starting by writing a business plan. So companies that weren't quite ready for investment, but getting prepared for that.
Yeah, and I read in the book that story, and I just think it's an interesting one for women in any kind of, business role. You told the story about how you had been recruited to another role and you'd accepted the role, and on your very last day, and I'll let you tell the story because it's a great one.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was recruited after having been at the Entrepreneurship Institute for about 2.5 years. I, of course, had worked my way up in the organization, and I even had an opportunity to run the agency or the institute interim while my boss had stepped into a new role and they were looking for a replacement. And I was recruited by a venture capital organization. So to be 25 and be recruited by a firm like that was a pretty incredible milestone for me. Was very excited about it. And on my last day, I got a call from my new boss, and he was freaking out. He's like, "You need to go outside the building." I was like, "I don't understand. What's going on?" And he said, "I just got a call from your boss, and he told me to rescind the offer and not to hire you, that you weren't going to leave your job." And I panicked because in that moment I thought, well, that's got to be illegal, right? Like you can't call somebody's new place of employment and threaten to not let them go. I think it was obviously from his perspective and the board who had hired me, their perspective was if they were crazy enough to make that phone call, then I was an employee that they didn't want to lose. So they fortunately did not rescind the offer. They did
Mm,
not change their mind. But it was a really eye-opening experience, and certainly one that it still shocks me to this day. I could never imagine doing that to someone. But hey, it turned out all right.
mm. And to do it on your last day of work, when you had everything organised and packed up, you said, I think you'd even having your farewell afternoon tea.
Yeah, we like had a great day. It was a great transition, and again, it was one of those work environments where we all worked together, and everyone that I worked with closely was really excited for me. It was a really amazing opportunity, and they were very supportive. So it was very shocking when this happened
Mm,
because it's one of those moments where you don't really know how to address it. And I did actually say something to the new executive director and said, I don't understand. And he's like, oh, well, I was told to do it by the head of the organization. And I'm like, well, if someone told you to jump off a bridge, you don't go jump off a bridge. And this was a man who had had 35 years of experience. It just was very bizarre to me. But certainly a stepping stone.
mm, mm. And you certainly had some, as going into entrepreneurship and, even working for other organisations, then transitioning to your own business. There's obviously some big lessons learned in all of that. What are some of if you were to pass knowledge on to other people, if you sort of say, learn from what I went through, what are the sort of big things you'd like people to take away?
The big things are, I would say, and one of the biggest things I talk about a lot is that we're all going to face adversity. It's a great equalizer among people, right? So whether we're just starting our career or we've been in our career for 20 years, we're all going to bump into situations and people or environments that don't meet our expectation or aren't exactly what they thought they would be. And I think that that's something that we should expect, not something that we should be shocked by. And so, where possible, learn what you can from those experiences. I'm not saying put up with those experiences, but what I'm saying is take something from them, take something good from those experiences. Because as I look back at some of those adverse moments or challenging work environments that I was in, it really shaped who I am today and who I am now as the CEO of a company. So, all very important. And had I not had those experiences, I don't think I'd have such a strong background in conflict resolution. So, I did learn something.
Mm. Because you certainly sounded in the book like you'd had your share of challenging bosses that you worked with.
I did. I think I was naive going into the workforce. I mean, I've been in business 25 years. So I'm, maybe 20 years ago, things happened more frequently. There was more gender bias, or, women were treated a little differently. I would like to think that we've come a little bit further since then, but I was naive, going into those work environments, having had parents that raised me to believe that if I worked hard enough and I was diligent and I put my nose down and I minded my own business and I just focused on the work that I could get there and I could have the career that I wanted. What I didn't expect, though, was that I would run into people who wanted to prevent me from getting to the next level or who would make it more difficult for me to achieve those goals. So definitely was surprising, but I would like to think that we've come a little bit further since then.
Mm. And I think that's one of the issues that does face a number of women in the workplace, and something that I quite often talk to clients about is we expect our work to speak for itself. You know, we, like you, we show up, we do a great job, we expect that that will be noticed and recognised, and in a lot of cases it isn't, because of the politics of the workplace. And, you know, workplace politics is one of the biggest challenges for women, because we often go into it with that, like, it's not necessarily naive, but it's just that expectation that we work hard and we get results for it. And it's just often not the case. And that can be the biggest challenge, is navigating all of that. So,
Correct.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So what led you to sort of exit working for other people and start your own business? What was the catalyst for that?
It was a challenging work environment. um, I had just come off another sort of what I would consider interesting experience. I was a senior strategist at an agency, and I was doing a great job, right? Working on pretty big projects, and had some visibility with the senior level management there. And I did have a manager, my direct manager, who got mad at me. I ended up getting the swine flu. I don't know if you remember the swine flu when that was popular years ago. But I had gotten the swine flu on a work trip that we were on. We were presenting to a very large oil and gas company for 5 days, and it was 25 stakeholders, the four of us. And on the last night there, um, my manager said, "Hey, get ready. We're going to a rave tonight. Julie, we need you to drive." And you know, I looked at him incredulously because I thought he was kidding. I was like, "We're not going to a rave. Like, we have to, what do you mean we're going to a rave? Like, what?" And he was actually serious. And I had said, "Well, hey, look, I have a 103 fever. We have to present all day tomorrow. Is it possible if I stay in? Right. And just order dinner? I don't feel well." And literally from that moment, for the next 2 weeks, it shifted the way he treated me. We ended up finishing the strategy session the next day. They were all hungover. They all smelled like beer and alcohol. One of the stakeholders at this oil and gas company, senior leadership, pulled me aside in the bathroom and said, "You're cutting this, and you're cutting this now. It's time to go." And I said, "I will let them know." So I went out and I explained to my boss what she had said to me, and he blamed me. He said that I caused this. I'm the one that said something to her. And I said, "Honestly, she approached me in the bathroom when I was in the stall. Like, this was not me going looking for her." And so after that business trip, we returned to Atlanta, and I was very, very ill for a number of days, could not be around people because it was so contagious. But he said that his expectation was that I worked from home, that I put together a 50-page PowerPoint. I completed this project. And when I say to you, he sent me a barrage of emails, email after email after email, 8 hours a day, just pressing me on delivering this PowerPoint. It was ridiculous. I mean, I couldn't even open my eyes. And once I recovered, I went back into the office and had no intention on quitting my job at all. And I walked around the corner, walked into his office, and he started again on the berating. And I said, "You know what? I just wanted to let you know today's my last day." And I quit.
Mm.
And I had no plan to do so, but it was in that moment that I realized how ridiculous this entire situation was. I was in my 20s, maybe had just turned 30. I was on a business trip with three men who are all older than I was. And they were expecting me to go party until 5 o'clock in the morning on a work trip. And I was being punished because I didn't play along. And that's where I drew my line in the sand, and I started my business the very next day.
Mm. Now, how did that, I mean, where, in terms of life stages, where were you at? Like, I'm just sort of thinking, if you're newly married or you've got young kids, or, starting a business can be a really big deal unless you're sort of in a position where you've got money behind you and support and things like that. So what was it like for you?
Absolutely. I don't advocate that you quit your job. I mean, I advocate for a little bit more planning. Okay. um, I was newly married. My husband is a successful entrepreneur and was at the time as well. So he already had his own businesses. I knew from a financial perspective, I had saved enough money so that we weren't at risk in terms of, bills and mortgage and whatever else we might have had. I knew that it wasn't going to put us in a bad financial situation. And it was prior to having children. So, the way I approached it was that I had money in my savings account and I knew I had enough to get me through a year, maybe a year and a half if I stretched it. And that was what I was going to use to grow the business. And I ultimately knew that if it did not work, I could have gone back and gotten another job in a different environment. I had skills that were, could be utilized in different organizations. So yes, I would say there's definitely a big financial component, and I definitely advocate for folks to have a plan, even a loose plan, a business plan, and a financial snapshot of what's in front of you, just so that you don't put yourself in a situation where you are worried about how you're going to pay the bills.
Mm. And starting a business, there's obviously a lot of things that you have to think about. And I know that from reading your book, you sat down and you had your huge to-do list that you had to work through. So sort of just work us through the things that you did in that sort of maybe first couple of weeks.
Yeah, first couple of weeks, I set up a new home office, and this was before working from home was popular. But I set up a makeshift office in one of our spare bedrooms, and I put together a list. And I started from the beginning. I needed a business plan. I needed a marketing strategy. I needed a financial plan. What was I going to do? Right? Like how was I going to spend the money? I needed a website. I needed to come up with an elevator pitch for my business. What was I going to sell? So all of these things that go into a business plan, I literally itemize them on a list. And every day I set my schedule from 8 to 5. So by 8 o'clock, I was in my office and I was going through one by one what those lists were. So even though in those early weeks, it was really just me and a lot of paperwork, I just forced myself to sit down and go through the process because it was very, very important to understand what I was selling. Because before I could call any of my colleagues or friends or people that I had worked with before, I had to be able to intelligently explain to them why I had taken this leap to start my own business.
Mm. So when you think about, the sort of starting of your business, how long did it take you to get your first clients and where did you find them?
It took, I want to say, I got my first consulting client within a month or two, and it was through referrals. I had some colleagues who were really great friends and had referred someone that they had known that was looking for a marketing strategy. Someone was looking for a website, but they were small. I mean, I think in that first year, maybe I had 20 or 30,000 in revenue. It wasn't a lot, but I took opportunities from referrals from people that I knew.
Hmm. And that's often the way that it happens in small business, isn't it? And I think it gets back to what we were talking about women, putting their heads down and doing their best work, is it often doesn't pay off for you inside organizations. But if you work for yourself, that's where the payoff happens because people then recognize the work that you've done. And I had the same experience starting my business it just came from referrals. Like I kind of went, here I am, I'm setting up business, this is what I'm doing. And then the work just started to come in because the payoff came from the work that I'd done, which wasn't necessarily recognized inside a business.
That you're absolutely correct. I mean, that's how it does happen. And I do think that it's a good stepping stone, the referrals. And of course, referrals then lead to more clients. And that gives you a portfolio that you can then share when the bigger clients come, right? When they
Mm,
find out about you or you get introduced to them. But you're absolutely correct. And I think what's also rewarding about that too is that the work that you're doing now is being seen,
mm,
right? By your clients and by the people that are hiring you.
yeah. And, as you go through the sort of startup stage, you get to the point where you have to start hiring your first people, your first team members. What are your sort of tips about if you're setting up a team from scratch, what would be your tips on finding the right fit, getting people that are going to work well together and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I would say when I started the business 15 years ago, it's different now. I feel like now there are a lot of platforms like Upwork or Fiverr or contract sites where you can get a contract to any person, right? In virtually any role. I will say for me, what was important when I started my business was that I didn't repeat the mistakes of my past work experiences. I wanted to make sure that if I was going to build a culture and hire people, that I wanted them to understand that I wasn't going to allow that mentality to creep into this environment. So it was hard in the beginning. I was very lucky in that I did have some contract employees that had worked with me for a year before we got our big break. They then became employees. I also had some colleagues who I had worked with in previous roles and brought them into the organization. So it's definitely very tricky. I will say culture, and what I've learned is that culture is important. And what I mean by culture is it's not necessarily the culture of what you do every day, but it's that when you bring people in, that they understand that this is the kind of environment that you're building: collaborative, teamwork, no ego. Because if you don't say that up front, and I've made this mistake, if you don't say that up front, sometimes when someone starts, you realize after the fact just how much they are not a fit with that. And I do think it's hard sometimes to suss out. So I would say when you're hiring, be very careful and also make sure that the people you are hiring have the skill sets that are going to help you get ahead. And I know that's also difficult in today's environment as well.
Mm. So when we were speaking a couple of days ago, one of the things that I really liked and we talked a little bit about was your philosophy of everybody leaves together at 5 o'clock, which is a very, very rare thing in today's business environment. And we talked a bit about how the boss staying late, even if you tell other people to go, they still get the feeling that they should be still there helping you because they feel guilty or they feel that that's the expectation. So when did that start for you, this idea of we all leave at the same time, and why did you put that in place, and what are the benefits you've seen from it?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, no, it's an amazing benefit that we have at our company. When I was 6 years into the business, I was fortunate enough to have my twin daughters, so I had to learn how to be a CEO and a mom, and all of the other things that come with that. So it was a messy year. But I will say that what I had to learn was to set a proper boundary. Prior to having kids, my husband and I both had our own businesses. We could work all day. We could work 12 hours a day. We could work 20 hours a day if we wanted. But when I had children, I realized that, working 24 hours a day wasn't necessarily productive, right? And so I made the decision that we would cut our work day and actually put it in our documents. It's also in offer letters. It's also in trainings that we give employees, that we get to work on time. That's the expectation. But we all leave on time, and that's the expectation. And so what we have found is that as an organization, we're very operationally efficient. We know exactly how much work we have on each employee's plate at a given time. And if that employee is chronically staying an hour, 2 hours after the workday, then something is wrong, right? Something's wrong either from a work balance perspective, or they're struggling with some part of the job. And so what I tell folks is we get out on time. So it may sound interesting, but we actually all meet at the door at 5 o'clock, and we all leave together at the same time every day. And we've also set that expectation with our clients that we are available during business hours, but if they do send an email or a communication after that time, they'll get a response the next morning, unless there's an emergency. Emergencies, there's a whole other process that's documented for them to get in touch with somebody should there be a critical error with a website or with a marketing plan. But by setting those boundaries, believe it or not, we've actually kept those boundaries. And I like it as well, because I then don't feel the weight of staying late or leaving early. I'm able to leave on time. And if I do have work to do after, I'll just do it after my kids go to bed. So I just didn't want my employees to feel like as you described, I didn't want them to be waiting around because I was in the office. I worked for those environments where my bosses would say, first in, last out.
Yeah.
Optically, you have to be in the seat. And so I changed the narrative. And, I'd like to think that now my employees can get home at a reasonable time. They can spend time with their family, friends, and do the things that they like to do in the evening without feeling that pressure of having to be available until they go to sleep.
Mm. I worked for a boss many, many years ago who his rule was we had to be in before him and we couldn't leave until he left. And so you'd have to be in before 8 o'clock in the morning, and he'd arrive anytime between 8 and 9. It was quite unpredictable. And some nights,
Oh,
like the childcare, I was a single mum, and the childcare centre used to close at 6. And sometimes it'd be 5:45, and I'd say to him, look, I have to leave because I've got to get the kids. And he'd say, I'll go
yeah.
get them and bring them back. And I'd be bringing, like, two and 3-year-old children back to the office and basically just, sitting them under my desk with sandwiches and saying, be really quiet, mummy's got to work. And looking back on that, it was insane.
Well, because I mean, what kind of work were you actually able to get done, right? You're essentially sitting there because he's requiring you to. And that's actually honestly what I realized when I set those boundaries is those first 6 years when I started my business, being available 24/7. I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, I would literally get emails at 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock. I'd answer them. Then they'd reply. Then it would go back and forth until 1 o'clock in the morning. And honestly, in most environments, unless you're dealing with overseas or time differences, most people don't have emergencies at 10:05 on a Thursday, right? So, it really helped, even from my perspective, give myself a little grace to say, you don't have to be in front of your computer 12 hours a day to do really solid work. So it was also a really good lesson for me as well.
Mm. And there's certainly lots of research that shows that there's a certain amount of time that people are productive for, and then after that time they're just not productive anymore.
Mhm.
And there's a few organisations in Australia, and in fact one in Tasmania here where we are in Hobart, that have trialled the 4-day working week, which is
Yeah.
everybody gets paid full-time wages. They work 4 days a week, but they're covering their 5 days worth of work in that 4 days. And they found that people can do that. The clients are still really happy, and the people are much happier because they get that extra day. They get the Friday or the Monday to do their sort of general things, doctor's appointments and go to the post office and get their hair cut and things that they don't necessarily
Yeah.
like taking up their weekends with. So there's certainly, look, I really applaud what you're doing. I just love the idea of we all meet at the door at 5 o'clock and we all leave together. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the day, believe it or not. I don't think I've ever told my employees that, but it really is because to me, it's that we've shut down for the day, we've left, and we try to all leave or have a joke or say something so that we're not leaving on a negative note, which we don't often, but it's a really cool thing to see.
Hmm. Because it kind of creates closure for the day, doesn't it? It lets people switch off, which
Oh,
is
absolutely. We're all
interesting.
talking about what we're going to go do that night. What does anyone have plans? And most times it's like during the week, we're like, yeah, we're just going to go home and have dinner and, and
Mm,
relax. But yeah, it is just really kind of a moment to take a breath and get in the car and sort of reset before we go to the next thing, whether it's coming home to our families or meeting friends. But it is really actually one of the favorite parts of my day.
mm. So, thinking about the people who'll be watching this who are leading teams, um, when you think about creating a great culture and creating a great place to work, what are some of the things that if you could go, here are my top pieces of advice for people, what would those be?
I would say culture has become such a buzzword, and I don't know that many organizations do it really well. I could say even our own environment is a work in progress. I think what's important when you are defining a culture is that you're defining it for all of the people in your environment. So not just Gen Z or millennials, but also Gen Xers or baby boomers who are still in the workforce. I feel sometimes like it's easy to get caught up in what all the cool companies are doing. They've got ping pong, they're doing paintball at 4, and that's what you have to do in order to recruit those employees. And we don't do those things at our office. Not because I don't think we should, but I also don't feel like everybody wants to go to paintball and they don't want to play ping pong. And so I focus on the things that hopefully everybody is after, which is, generous paid time off. We do give an additional paid holiday so that families are always together at the holidays without having to worry about taking vacation. Um, you know, Small things like that, I think, help build a culture. I think also setting boundaries on the workday helps set culture. But for anyone that's leading a team, I would say look at the broad team, look at everyone on the team, and come up with a culture that is reflective of all of those people, not just the loudest voices in the room.
Mm. And that's really great advice because we often do that. We sort of look at what's the latest, greatest thing coming through. We go, what are Google doing? What are all these
Mhm.
innovative companies doing? And they are doing things like, playing ping pong
They're
and
amazing.
You know, and
Yeah.
it's incredible if that's the kind of environment you really enjoy. You know, I remember reading about Atlassian, which is an Australian company, and they, you know, they kind of employ tech bros, and they live in the office. They basically have fridges stocked with food so they can eat anytime. They've got beds they can crash in. They've got bean bags. They have basketball hoops out the back. And the tech bros don't bother renting an apartment because they just live in the office, which is great if you're like, you know, 21, just out of university with no family.
There you go.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is happening even in a lot of our larger environments here, is that they built this culture of fun and, oh, we have all these events, and then guess what? Those employees start families, they start buying homes, and they're no longer interested in those benefits anymore. And so you're kind of stuck then going, okay, well, now we have to shift again. And so that's why I say look at the entire environment, and then also make sure that that culture is reflective of the type of environment that you want to build. I think, my parents ingrained in me a long time ago, keep your eyes on your own paper, meaning that it's so easy as a business owner to look at Google, look at Facebook, look at all these things that they offer. And I'm none of those things. I'm not Facebook. I'm not these large organizations that can offer this, but I look at what I'm building and I look at what I want this business to reflect. And that is where you need to focus, because I don't have Google's money. If I had Google's money, we might have a massage therapist or a spa that we can go to at lunch, right? But I don't have Google's money.
Yeah. And it's about, you know, it's about how people treat each other at the end of the day. That's really what culture's all about. It's not about the perks. I mean, the perks are great. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure that tech bros love Atlassian and would love to work there. But it's
Yeah.
that thing of you've got to look at how people behave and how they treat each other and the expectations that we set, which is really important. And a big part of that is communication. You've got a chapter in your book called The Art of Communication. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I found, I think it started, well, I know it started when I was working for my parents' restaurant. I would say I'm a naturally curious individual. And I, even as a waitress, loved talking to different people. I loved learning about where they were coming from, where they were visiting. I also built relationships with locals who came in, for lunch and dinner several times a week. And I learned how to speak to them. And at the time I was 16, right? And when I left, I was in 22 when I moved to Philadelphia. And so I built these relationships, and I think what struck me even then was I had this ability to talk to people, to talk to different types of people, and to learn that not everybody speaks the same way, receives messaging the same way. And so, I do believe that communication in any environment can be the difference between success or failure. It isn't just about speaking clearly and speaking directly. It's also that point of understanding how people communicate and how they receive messages, because a lot of times that can create miscommunication, or it can cause other situations that you don't intend. And so communication at its core, it seems foundational, but it is. And it's something that we don't focus on, right? We've got technology now. We're not trained in colleges on how to create a smart email, right? One that is informative, one that is professional. And I will say in my own business, regardless of how many years of experience you come in with, we train you on these things because it's something that isn't taught in other places. And we have a very specific way that we communicate with our clients, whether you're dealing with me or you're dealing with a member of my team. There should be a consistent voice and tone across all of that. So communication is incredibly important.
Hmm. Yeah, particularly I like the idea of consistent voice and tone across all the messaging, so that it doesn't matter if you're dealing with the CEO or you're dealing with somebody who's just started, you get the same consistent message from a business, which I think is important.
Yes.
Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about work-life balance and, the balancing of being a mum with working. And that must have been a really big challenge as a CEO, particularly owning your own business, to sort of go through the process of having twins. My daughter's had twins, so I'm grandma of two twin boys. So I'm
Oh, that's
watching it,
awesome.
I'm helping out as much as I can, but I sort of watch it from the outside and go, I don't know how they cope. It's so full on. Advice, if you sort of think about advice that you give working mums, particularly in that sort of, pregnancy, little tiny kids, where you're, at that sort of stage where you're really trying to balance not getting enough sleep, looking after kids and so on. What advice would you give people around that?
Well, the first thing, and I know I mentioned this earlier, but I would give yourself some grace. That's the number one thing. I wish I'd given myself grace then. You know, being a mom and juggling children and raising humans is incredibly difficult, right? It's harder than any job will ever do. But I do think that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be amazing and perfect at everything that we do. And sometimes giving yourself some permission to not be perfect and permission for it to be chaotic is sometimes um, it can help you reset because it is difficult. And you know, I would say also put the boundaries in place, right? So if you are feeling stressed or you're going through a particularly challenging time and you are running your business, allow yourself to take some time to deal with that, whether it's a sick child, whether it's you yourself need some sleep. You know, make sure that you're putting those boundaries around you so that you can thrive, right? You can't live on no sleep. You can't live without eating. You can't run 24/7. You're going to run yourself into the ground. And I know that because I did it, right? I thought I could do it all. And that first year of having kids, you know, being a new mom and then being a new mom to two kids, one who has some issues with, you know, asthma and pretty serious issues when she was a baby. I learned that sometimes my schedule wasn't predictable and I just had to do the best that I could. But I would encourage, you know, working moms to stick with it, and it may not seem like you're moving as fast as you'd like, but there is no timetable. So whether it takes you 6 months to adjust or it takes you a year to adjust, it's okay.
Mm. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. It really is a tricky balance for a lot of women, particularly those who, don't have the choice but to have to go back to work,
Mhm.
and just that sort of balancing of children and not getting any sleep. And it's the same for fathers as well. I mean, my
Mhm.
son and his wife recently had a baby. He's 3 months old, and I'm sort of looking at my son who's, looking completely haggard at the moment. And I'm kind of really
It's
feel
true.
yeah, it's like bags under the eyes and practically falling asleep when I'm talking to him. And he's holding down a job and doing all of that. Um,
Mhm.
so you talk to in your book about generational divide. So can you tell us some of the things from that chapter and maybe some of the stories?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've all experienced this, but when you have so many different generations in a work environment, and I kind of alluded to it before, is that sometimes all you hear is the loudest voice, right? You're only hearing the one generation that maybe is speaking louder than others. I would say the way that I've always looked at it is that we all have something to bring to the table, and I've been very fortunate that I've worked with a lot of baby boomers who have been some of my greatest mentors, right? Have taught me a lot of great things. They've taught me resourcefulness, right? So when they started their careers, they didn't have technology, they didn't have email, they didn't have the ability to pull up their phone and Google, um, how do you do X, Y, and Z, right? They were given a job, they were given a phone, they had probably some inner office notes or something, and they had to figure it out on their own. So there's a lot of ingenuity there with that generation. And I know that when you're in a generation where you have young people, they tend to sort of roll their eyes, and they roll their eyes at me too, by the way. And I'm a Gen Xer, um, but you know, they don't understand what it was like before we had all of those things. They've grown up in technology, but I will say this: I've learned things from my Gen Z employees who have found me a better, faster way to do something that I have painstakingly been doing in 10 steps that I can now do in two. So I do think that if you keep your mind open to being curious and learning, not just how to work together, but learning about what they bring to the table, it will definitely improve your capability. It'll improve how you operate in that environment, and it will help you when the next generation comes in and they're rolling their eyes at you.
Yes, like our kids roll their eyes at us. And that whole sort of generations fitting multiple generations together, which is what we get. We've still got baby boomers in the workforce, and we've got the sort of millennials coming in, and the newer generations. They've got very different experiences and very different ideas about life. And I like what you're talking about sort of adapting to all of it rather than going, because I'm a Gen X, this is how I like to work, and everybody in my team's just got to put up with it and adapt so you all work the same way as me, which just
Yeah.
isn't productive. So it's a sort of picking out the strengths of all the different generations.
Yeah, and I think it's also to what you just said too about managing their expectations, right? So, I come from an environment where, you stay late, you get the job done, you don't leave until the work's done.
Mm,
Newer generations are offended if they have to, stay late or they're asked to do something that's maybe outside of what they want to do. So I think there's a delicate balance. And I think even in my own company, I would say to you, even though COVID had happened, we still, after 8 weeks, we went back 5 days a week. We never were a work force that worked from home. And then I acquiesced because that was the expectation of most people, was some type of flexibility. And so we now have work from home Wednesday, where we all get to work from home 1 day a week in the middle of the week. And I give that as not a condition of employment, but a benefit of employment, so that if any one of the employees is taking advantage of that benefit, that I reserve the right to bring them back into the office on that day. And we have had some people take advantage of that, but I will say the majority of folks love the fact that they can, have their yoga pants on and they don't necessarily have to get in the car for an hour each way. And I've actually found that I enjoy having 1 day a week working from home. I can sort of, hole up in my office and I don't have to race around to get there. So I would say I've even bent what I would normally want in a work environment to show them that, hey, look, even though this is what, the standard that I want to set, I'm going to meet you halfway, right? I'm not going to let you work from home 4 days a week because that doesn't work for our business, but we'll start with 1 day. Maybe we'll get to 2 days a week. If we can prove that we can still be productive. So I do think it's a delicate balance, but it can be done. But in larger organizations, I do think it's much harder to be nimble on
mm.
those things.
And one of the things about that we know about the newer generations coming into the workforce is that they are going to be looking at kind of like portfolio careers rather than specifically working in an industry or even for a single organisation. And
Mhm.
we do know that a number of them are doing side hustles. That kind of seems to be the big thing. Is you do your job, you also have your side hustle doing something, being an influencer or
Mhm.
running a YouTube channel or having e-commerce or something like that. Do you see that as being something that's going to, down the track become more prevalent? Do you think everyone's going to have a side gig? And how do you think that's going to fit in with, running offices and running businesses?
Having a side hustle, if your employees all have a side hustle, it can negatively impact your business. At the end of the day, while we like to think that a side hustle is something we only do on the side, the reality is eventually that side hustle is going to creep into your 9 to 5 or your 8 to 6 or whatever your working hours are. And I will say, as an employer, I do look at those things. I want employees that want to build a career, they want a job that they can grow in. And I will say, when they're focused on the side hustle, that is actually where all of their really positive energy is. And then we tend to not see a lot of that on the day to day because they're tired. So I do think that it can be a vehicle for some folks to go from working for someone else to having their own business. But I do find it problematic long term when you have employees who are not loyal to the organizations that are paying their salaries and their benefits. And while they're focused on building their own business. And that's also largely why when I made the decision to leave my company, I had been thinking about starting a business, but I didn't want to have one foot in and one foot out. I didn't feel like that was fair to my employer because, after all, I was getting paid a very respectable salary and I respected the fact that they were investing in me. So I love that people want to start their own businesses. I'm not saying you can't have the side hustle, but I do see it as problematic long term.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's going to be one of the things that as managers and leaders and employers is something we're going to have to grapple with, particularly as the new generations enter the workforce. I mean, I was reading some stats recently about children in the UK, and I can't remember the number, but it was ridiculously high. It was something like 80% of children in the UK, their career aspiration is to be a YouTuber,
Ugh,
which is, there's only
yeah.
going to be so many YouTubers in the world. There's kind of not everybody's going to be successful at it. So I think we're going to be facing a lot more of that, this sort of side hustle, running a business on the side, doing something else. Or even if it's not making them money, it's their passion. Maybe their passion is to be doing YouTube. They're not going to make money out of it. So they're going to be still, having a job. But it is, like you said, how do you keep them focused? How do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them, this is the job that's paying you bills? It's
Mhm.
going to be a tricky one.
It's No, it's very tricky. And I think even from I know in in the United States, we've gone through what I would like to hope we're moving out of, which is people were leveling up every 6 months. They'd get a job, they'd stay, they'd level up the next 6 months. And they did this for 3 or 4 years. What we are seeing now is those folks that are coming to these companies with 4 years of experience is not actual experience. It's that they sat in a job for 6 months, got a new one, but you don't really ever master the skills in a role until you're there for longer than a year. So if you aren't actually learning and developing a skill set and all you're doing is jumping from place to place, look 5 years down the road. We're going to have a large percentage of our workforce that's not trained, that didn't pick up skill sets that are transferable. And then we're really, as business owners, then we're really in trouble, right? And I'm seeing that now. And that's why training is such a big thing when anyone comes to our firm. They can say to me, well, hey, I've worked at another agency for 6 years. That's okay, because I guarantee you didn't do it this way. I
Yeah.
guarantee you didn't follow this process. And so there's a lot of training. It doesn't mean I'm training them on every part of their job, but there are a lot of things that they're not picking up from those environments. So it's going to be challenging, I think, the next decade in that sort of transition when people realize that YouTube isn't a long-term career and that now they have to focus on building one.
Mm. And it's going to be I think it's just going to be a very, very different work environment. Where, I'm Gen X as well. And, I, like you, grew up in an environment where, back sort of pre the 1990s, where you could expect to start a job and probably stay in that same agency or that same organization until you retired. And you
Mhm.
reached 65 and they gave you a gold watch and a morning tea and sent you off into the world. And,
Yep.
and then the 90s came and all the restructures and the redundancies and all that sort of thing. And we started to realize that we couldn't have that type of career. But I think we're just seeing the extreme the other way. It's like the pendulum swung the other way, and we are getting people with very short, very short stays in organisations.
Yeah, no, and I would like to think, and again, maybe this is just the hopeful side of it, but I'd like to see it swing back the other way. I'd love for folks that honestly want to start businesses, go, please start them. I mean, look, I started my own and I love it, but I'd also love to see people invest in those organizations that are investing in them. And I do actually think in the last couple of years, I've started to see a little bit of a shift in the mentality because people want to buy homes, they want to buy cars, they want to start families, and it's not inexpensive anymore. And, a side hustle is just that, right? And yes, it might bring in some additional money, but it may not necessarily bring in enough for you to live sustainably. So,
Hmm. And being a CEO of a company, there's a lot of things that you have to consider. And I suppose one of those is around succession planning, which I think is a big issue for a lot of organisations. I don't see many organisations with an effective succession plan in place for any of their roles, let alone the CEO role. So what steps have you taken or are you thinking about taking in your business to make sure you've got a really solid succession plan in place?
yeah, it actually, I mean, it's interesting that you bring this up because, I always looked at business and as that when you start it, you always have to see the end in front of you. So you build a business with the end in mind. And so what that means really is that you're not just building a business to build it and, you're going to work it every day, but you have to build it and know like, hey, in the future, do I want to sell this to my employees? Do I want to sell this to an investor? Do I want to grow it and find somebody who wants to take it over? Those are things that you should be asking yourself even at the beginning, right? Have the fortitude to put together a vision for what you want this to look like, and it might change, right? So if you'd have said to me 15 years ago I'd still be running Junction 15 years later, I would have been like, I'll be out in 10 years. But the reality is 15 years can go by really quickly. But my goal, even for myself, I definitely have plan A, B, and C. And there are three different paths that I can go. So as I build the company, I'm building it to have certain things that are attractive to potential investors, or I'm building it so that if somebody did want to step in, or if any of my employees did want to take over the business one day, that there's a path and a way for that to happen. So I would encourage anyone. I know it sounds silly to start a business with the end in mind, but always have that kind of on the back of your the back of your mind, because you never know when that opportunity might pop up. And what I see, like to your point, is that I see right now a lot of companies who've been in the space for 40 or 50 years, their kids don't want the business. And it's a business that's highly specialized. So it's difficult to find somebody that can come in and run that. And so they're figuring that out, though, at the end, not 5 years before they want the end to happen. So I think it's really important to just keep that always in the back of your mind.
Absolutely. I've just realised the time is getting away from us, so I'm going to throw the floor open and see if anybody's got any questions for Julie or any comments.
Oh, I've got something. I was interested in what you were talking about when you're, and thanks very much, Julie. It's been really fascinating. When you were hiring people, you brought some people on that you knew, and so you knew they were a good fit for your organisation. With people that you didn't know, how did you set that up right from the beginning? Was that part of how you were advertising and how you were interviewing? What did that look like?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I've been very lucky. I have some employees. I have two that have been with me since the very beginning. I have one, Susan, who's been with me for 8 years, another that's been with me for 3. So yes, I definitely have folks that have stuck around for a while. For whenever I go to hire, I don't traditionally utilize a recruiting firm. I find that I lose a little bit of personalization when I do that. I also control the process. So I will post job descriptions on LinkedIn. I'll put together job descriptions based on what they need. And then I will filter through, it's painstaking, but I will filter through all of those applications, and I invariably will pick, a handful, less than a handful of people to actually interview. And then we have a staged approach where I typically will do the first intake call, because I've got a pretty good gut read on a lot of folks. So if in the first 30 minutes, I know it's not a fit, there's no point in running them through a more serious process. And I know that's different for some organizations, but I do think that that's how I've also been able to weed out or eliminate individuals that in the final stage, we've just wasted 2 weeks, right? Because everyone else has gone through the process and then I meet them. So I meet them first, which is odd to them as well, but they meet me first, and then they'll meet with our director of operations, and then we bring them in. If they make it through that conversation, they'll come in for an in-person meeting. And typically by that point, we've had 2 or 3 touch points with that individual. We've been able to check some references, background, validate their career before we submit an offer. But it's a pretty boring process, but LinkedIn's been a really good tool for us. We did use Indeed before as well. Didn't find as many candidates for the roles that we needed through Indeed. But LinkedIn has been very good for us.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other
I
questions?
suppose that means that everyone else. I'm in government, so slightly different process, but I suppose the benefit of your process too is once someone starts, because the rest of the staff know they've been through that, they're feeling really confident about the new person as well.
Yes. And I will, when they come in person, they will meet with other individuals in the office, because I feel that sometimes my gut is wrong. I've been wrong several times, so I'm not perfect, but in those conversations, they will pick up something different than what I picked up. And so we'll compare notes, and that typically helps us make a decision. And I actually solicit that feedback from my team to say, what did you think? Because I don't want to bring in somebody that's going to throw off the dynamic or that's not going to understand, how we operate.
Thank you.
Sue, you came off mute before. Did you have a question?
I do. Hi, Julie. Thank you very much. This has been terrific. Good start to my working day.
Oh, great.
Just a quick question, sort of on what Jenny was referring to as well. I work in a very large organisation. We have over 1,000 employees, and we offer flexible working environment. So that means anywhere from, I take care, not me personally, but staff will take carers leave because they've got sick kids, or, it's school holidays. Or I want to start at 7 and I want to leave at 3 because that works for me. And we allow all of this, which can cause quite an amount of chaos at different times.
Sure.
how do you go when your staff are saying to you, you know, oh, look, I've got this, or I want to be able to do this? Are you very strict on your hours of the day? And do you say, look, I realise that you've got a family, however, you need a backup plan. You can't be taking time off all the time because your kids are sick? Or do you go along with that? It's a very different world from what it was years ago.
It is. So here's what I will tell you. I'm flexible, but not, right? So the hours of the work environment are, folks can pick 8 to 5 or 9 to 6. That is it. And once you pick one, that is what you always work. There has to be consistency across all of this. Otherwise, I don't know how you manage that many people with that much flexibility. And so what I give them is work from home Wednesday. The hours are still 8 to 5, right? We're not working in the evening and playing with our kids all day. I do say to folks that, look, life happens. If you have a doctor's appointment, if your child is sick, then that certainly isn't going to be, you're not going to be penalized for that, right? You don't have to use your vacation because you have to take care of that. However, if you abuse it, because people will abuse it, I can then start utilizing your paid time off, right, to account for that. And I've had employees that have had 14 doctor's appointments in 2 months. They don't have 14 doctor's appointments in 2 months. And so I will gently remind them that, hey, right, this sort of constitutes pushing the boundary with what's possible. But to your point, it sounds like you have an environment where really people have a lot of flexibility. I would say if you can find points of consistency, so it's you pick it and you stick with it, right? You're being flexible and giving them that opportunity, but you're not giving them the opportunity to make it unmanageable. And I say this to employees. I've even said this on other podcasts as well, is that we have to get employees to understand that the job description doesn't exist to meet their expectation. The job exists to meet the demands of the business. So that role requires certain things that you have to execute. And while, yes, flexibility to do those things is really, really nice, and it's a really great benefit, but it is a benefit. And so where possible, making sure that they understand that, because at the end of the day, work is work. And you're right, with more than 1,000 employees, I can't imagine chasing those schedules. I really can't. I mean,
it can be tricky.
Yeah, it can be. And because not everybody will take advantage of it, but there will be a percentage that don't understand that by, maybe taking advantage of it, what that can potentially do to the work output.
Sure. And it builds a discrimination. For example, my kids are growing up. I don't have kids. So what do I get in return for, John Smith, or whoever is taking time off to look after their kids? It's kind of ends up a bit of a one-way street for some people, and they go, well, I'm here all the time. So yeah, it can be quite tricky to manage. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Any other questions? All good? All right. Well, we're actually right on just about 10 o'clock here. So, Julie, I just want to extend a really huge thank you for your time. It's been a really lovely conversation. We've covered quite a wide range of things, and it's all been incredibly valuable. Now, I don't have a physical copy of the book here because I sent like a pre-release PDF version of it, which I didn't print because I don't want to kill too many trees. I read it online.
Yes,
but I really
it's a lot of trees.
It is. I really encourage you to get the book. I will drop links. What we'll do is we'll send the link out to everybody. Once we send the recording out as well, we'll send you the link to buy the book. But yeah, it's a really great read. Like I said, it's very conversational. It's just like the conversation we just had. It's just like having a chat with Julie. It's an easy read. It's a lot of really big aha moments and great learnings in the book too. So thank you so much, Julie. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. And thank you for all joining. I know it is in the middle of your workday, but I appreciate that you came, and what a great conversation. And again, we all probably are experiencing a lot of the same things. And sometimes it's helpful to know that there's comrades that we're in it together, right?
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate all of your time, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.